Captain Jack Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Defiance and watched the stars through the main viewing screen. His ship was humanity's last hope against an enemy that had crushed every human colony in the Outer Rim. The Galactic Council had declared war on humanity 3 years ago, and they were winning badly. Their ships were faster, and their weapons were stronger than anything humans could build. They had better shields and more advanced technology than Earth had ever seen before. Morrison was 42 years old and had served in the human fleet for 20 years. He had brown hair that was starting to turn gray at the sides and blue eyes that had seen too much war. His uniform was clean but worn from years of constant fighting. The other officers on his bridge looked tired and worried because they all knew the truth that command tried to hide from the regular soldiers. Humanity was losing this war, and there was almost no chance of winning it the normal way. Lieutenant Kate Sullivan sat at the tactical station and studied the enemy movement reports that came in every hour. She was 28 years old, with red hair and green eyes, and she was one of the best tactical officers in the human fleet. She had joined the military right after the Council attacked the first human colonies, and she had never known peacetime. Her job was to find ways to hurt the enemy and protect human ships, but lately there were fewer human ships to protect every day. Commander Ben Parker worked at the engineering station and tried to keep the Defiance running with parts that were getting harder to find. He was 35 years old and had black hair and brown eyes, and hands that were always dirty from fixing broken equipment. Before the war, he had designed engines for civilian ships, but now he spent his time making weapons, work, and keeping life support systems from failing. The Council had cut off most of the supply lines to human space, so every broken part had to be fixed instead of replaced. Ensign Danny Rodriguez sat at the navigation station and plotted courses through space that was getting more dangerous every day. He was only 24 years old with dark hair and brown eyes, and he was the best pilot that Morrison had ever seen. He could make the Defiance move through asteroid fields and nebulas where bigger ships could not follow, and he had saved their lives more times than anyone could count. His hands moved over the navigation controls like he was born to fly through. So, the communication system buzzed, and Morrison pressed the button to receive the message. The voice that came through belonged to Admiral George Hayes, who commanded what was left of the human fleet from his headquarters on Mars. The Admiral sounded tired and old when he spoke, and Morrison knew that the news would be bad before he heard the words. The Admiral told Morrison that intelligence reports confirmed the Council was preparing to use planet-killer weapons against Earth itself within the next 72 hours. Morrison felt his stomach drop when he heard those words. Because planet-killer weapons could destroy entire worlds in minutes, the Council had used them on 2 human colonies already, and both planets were now dead rocks floating in space with no life left on them. If they used those weapons on Earth, then humanity would be finished forever because Earth was where most humans lived and where all the important government and military leaders worked. The Admiral continued talking and explained that the Council's war effort was controlled by something called the Central Command Matrix that was located on their throne world of Vaxtara Prime. This was a quantum computer that coordinated all Council military operations across 17 different star systems. It told every Council ship where to go and what to attack and when to do it. Without the command matrix, the Council forces would lose their coordination and become much easier to fight. The problem was that Vaxtara Prime was the most heavily defended world in Council space, with shields that could stop any human weapon, and fleets of warships that surrounded the planet in multiple layers of defense. No human ship had ever gotten close enough to attack the planet and survive long enough to do any real damage. The command matrix was located deep inside the planet in a facility that was built to survive direct hits from the most powerful weapons in the galaxy. Morrison listened to the Admiral explain a desperate plan that had been developed by human scientists and engineers working around the clock for the past 6 months. They had managed to reverse engineer jump drive technology from captured Council ships, and they had built an experimental system that could theoretically allow a ship to jump directly into the core of a planet instead of jumping through normal space. The technology had never been tested because the chances of survival were estimated at less than 2%. The plan was for the Defiance to use this experimental jump technology to appear directly in the molten core of Vaxtara Prime, where the command matrix facility was located. Once there, they would deploy a quantum virus that human programmers had designed to destroy Council computer systems from the inside. The virus would spread through the Council's quantum communication networks and turn their own coordination systems against them. Morrison looked around his bridge at the officers who had served with him through 3 years of desperate fighting. He saw Kate Sullivan checking weapon systems and preparing tactical plans, even though she knew this mission was probably suicide. He saw Ben Parker running diagnostics on the experimental jump drive that might kill them all in the next few seconds, or might give humanity its only chance to survive. He saw Danny Rodriguez plotting a course to Vaxtara Prime, even though they all knew they would probably never see home again. The captain asked his crew if they wanted to volunteer for this mission, and every single officer on the bridge said yes without hesitation. They had all lost friends and family members to Council attacks, and they all knew that Earth would be destroyed if they did nothing. The odds of survival were terrible, but the odds of humanity surviving without this mission were even worse. Morrison gave the order to prepare for the experimental jump, and the ship began to vibrate as the new drive system charged up with energy. Through the viewing screen, he could see Council ships moving to intercept them near the Centauri system, but they would not arrive in time to stop the jump. The Defiance had one chance to save humanity, and Jack Morrison was going to take that chance, even if it killed him and everyone on his ship. The jump drive reached full power, and Morrison gave the final order. The stars disappeared, and everything went white as the Defiance jumped toward the core of the most heavily defended world in the galaxy. In a few seconds, they would either be dead or they would be humanity's last hope for survival deep inside enemy territory where no human had ever gone before. The white light faded, and Jack Morrison opened his eyes to see something that should have been impossible. The USS Defiance was floating in a sea of liquid metal that glowed red and orange with heat that could melt any normal ship in seconds. They were inside the core of Vaxtara Prime, surrounded by molten metal that was heated to millions of degrees by the pressure and gravity of the planet above them. The experimental phase shift generators were the only thing keeping them alive in this hellish environment. Ben Parker worked frantically at his engineering station as alarms screamed throughout the ship. The phase generators were running at maximum power and drawing energy from every system they could spare. The hull temperature was rising rapidly despite the phase field protection, and Parker knew they had minutes before the generators failed completely. He rerouted power from life support systems and weapons to keep the phase field stable while sweat poured down his face from the heat that was starting to penetrate their shields. Danny Rodriguez stared at his navigation screens in amazement because they had actually materialized exactly where they had planned to appear. The jump drive had worked perfectly and placed them in the exact center of Vaxtara Prime's molten core. His instruments showed a massive artificial structure about 2 kilometers, a way that was suspended in the liquid metal by powerful gravity fields. The structure was made of some kind of crystal that glowed with its own internal light, and it was easily the size of a human city. Kate Sullivan identified the structure as the Central Command Matrix Facility through her tactical sensors. The facility's shields were designed to protect it from attacks that came from space above the planet, but they were not designed to stop intrusions from within the planetary core itself. The Council had never imagined that any species would be crazy enough to jump a ship directly into the center of a planet, because such a maneuver should have killed everyone instantly. Morrison studied the tactical display and saw that the command matrix was protected by automated defense systems that were starting to respond to their presence. Energy beams lanced out from the crystalline structure, but they were designed to work in space, and they could not function properly in the dense liquid metal environment. The facility's designers had assumed that nothing could survive long enough in the planetary core to pose a threat to their most important military installation. The captain ordered Parker to maintain the phase field at all costs, while Sullivan prepared to deploy humanity's most desperate weapon. The quantum virus had been designed by Earth's best computer programmers working in secret laboratories for the past year. It was not just a simple computer virus, but a cascading program that would learn and adapt as it spread through Council networks. The virus was designed to turn the Council's own network connectivity against them by using their quantum communication systems to spread confusion and chaos. Parker reported that the phase generators were starting to overload and the hull was beginning to buckle under the immense pressure of the planetary core. The gravitational forces around them were strong enough to crush mountains, and the heat was slowly penetrating their defenses despite the phase field protection. Warning lights flashed red throughout the bridge, and the ship vibrated as stressed metal began to bend and warp under forces that no human technology was designed to withstand. Rodriguez worked to position the ship closer to the command matrix facility while avoiding the automated defense systems that were trying to destroy them. The liquid metal made normal movement almost impossible, but the phase drive allowed them to slip through the molten environment like a ghost. He had to be careful not to get too close to the facility's gravity fields because they were strong, enough to tear the Defiance apart even with the phase protection active. Sullivan found the access points she needed to deploy the quantum virus directly into the command matrix's computer core. The facility used quantum communication links to coordinate Council military operations across 17 star systems, and those same links would become the virus's highway into every Council network. She prepared the virus for deployment while monitoring Council security protocols that were finally starting to detect their presence inside the supposedly impregnable planetary core. The command matrix facility began to rotate as massive mechanical systems came online to deal with the unprecedented intrusion. Energy fields sparked and flashed in the liquid metal as the facility's defenses tried to target the human ship that had appeared where no ship should be able to survive. Council engineers had built the facility to be the ultimate command center, but they had never planned for an attack from within the planet itself. Morrison watched the tactical display as Council security forces finally realized what was happening, and began to mobilize every available unit to protect their most important installation. But they were too late because the Defiance was already inside their defenses and positioned to strike at the heart of their military coordination system. The captain knew his ship was dying around him, but they had achieved something that the Council had thought was impossible. Parker shouted a warning as the phase generators began to fail and the ship's hull started to crack under the enormous pressure. They had perhaps 2 minutes before the Defiance would be crushed like an egg by forces that could reshape continents. The crew worked with desperate efficiency to complete their mission before their ship was destroyed by the hellish environment they had voluntarily entered. Sullivan armed the quantum virus and prepared to inject it directly into the command matrix's quantum core through a tight beam transmission. The virus contained years of human research into Council computer systems, and it was designed to spread like wildfire through their networks while appearing to be legitimate traffic. Once deployed, the virus would begin learning Council protocols and using them to create chaos throughout their military command structure. The hull groaned, and metal screamed as the Defiance began its final death throes in the molten core of Vaxtera Prime. Morrison gave the order to deploy the virus, and Sullivan transmitted humanity's last hope directly into the heart of the Council's military coordination system. The virus streamed across the gap between the dying human ship and the massive crystalline facility that controlled the fate of 17 star systems. In seconds, the quantum virus would either save humanity or die with the crew of the Defiance in the crushing depths of an alien world's molten core. The quantum virus struck the command matrix like lightning and spread through the facility's computer systems faster than any Council security protocol could respond. Within the first few seconds, it had accessed the primary coordination networks that controlled military operations across all Council territories, and it began to learn everything about how the Council's war machine functioned. The virus was not just destroying data, but studying it and turning the Council's own strategic algorithms against them. Admiral Zexhai stood in the command center of his flagship, high above Vaxtera Prime, and watched his tactical displays with growing horror. The quantum virus had reached his ship's communication systems and was issuing orders that contradicted everything he had planned for the final assault on Earth. Battle groups that should have been moving toward human space were receiving commands to attack each other instead. The virus had learned to perfectly imitate Council command protocols and was using them to create chaos throughout the fleet. The virus spread through quantum communication links at the speed of light and reached every Council installation in the star system within minutes. It studied each new network it encountered and adapted its tactics based on what it learned about Council military procedures. The virus began issuing contradictory orders that appeared to come from legitimate sources and created confusion among Council forces that had never experienced communication failures on this scale. Inside the command matrix facility deep in Vaxtera Prime's core, the quantum virus took control of strategic planning computers that had coordinated Council victories for over 1,000 years. It accessed databases containing detailed information about every Council military unit and began sending them orders that would cripple their effectiveness. Fleets received commands to move to empty sectors of space while supply convoys were redirected to uninhabited systems where they would run out of fuel. The USS Defiance continued to die slowly in the molten metal surrounding the command matrix, as Ben Parker fought desperately to keep the phase generators running for just a few more minutes. The ship's hull was cracking and buckling under gravitational forces that could flatten entire cities, but the crew refused to give up while their virus was still spreading through Council networks. Every second they survived meant more time for the virus to establish itself in systems throughout the galaxy. Kate Sullivan monitored the virus's progress through her tactical displays and watched it penetrate deeper into Council command structures with each passing moment. The virus had learned to forge authentication codes and security clearances that gave it access to the most sensitive military databases. It was systematically downloading everything the Council knew about their own forces and using that information to turn their coordination systems into weapons of mass confusion. Danny Rodriguez tried to keep the ship positioned near the command matrix facility, while the phase drive slowly failed around them. The gravitational fields from the facility were pulling at the Defiance with tremendous force, and only his exceptional piloting skills kept them from being torn apart by tidal forces that could stretch metal like rubber. He could feel the ship coming apart beneath his hands, but he continued to make tiny course corrections that kept them alive for precious additional seconds. The quantum virus reached the automated defense networks that protected Council installations throughout their territory and began to turn those defenses against their own creators. Planetary shields that had protected Council worlds for centuries suddenly began fluctuating wildly as the virus sent conflicting commands to control systems. The perfectly coordinated defense networks that had made Council space impregnable were becoming unreliable and unpredictable. Admiral Zexhai tried to issue override commands to regain control of his forces, but the virus had anticipated this response and was blocking his communications with false authentication failures. Every order he sent was either ignored or replaced with contradictory instructions that appeared to come from even higher-ranking officials. The virus had studied Council hierarchy and was using their own chain of command against them by impersonating leaders who did not even exist. Morrison watched the tactical displays as the virus spread beyond military networks and began attacking the economic systems that supported the Council's war effort. Supply lines that had functioned perfectly for generations were suddenly rerouting cargo to empty space, while financial networks credited massive resource transfers to accounts that had never been created. The Council's bureaucracy was collapsing under the weight of its own complexity as the virus exploited every weakness in their integrated computer systems. The virus learned about hidden human resistance cells from captured Council intelligence files and began broadcasting coded messages that provided them with detailed information about Council weaknesses. Resistance fighters who had been hiding in the shadows for 3 years suddenly received precise intelligence about shield frequencies and security protocols that could allow them to strike at previously invulnerable targets. The virus was not just defending itself but actively recruiting allies among the Council's enemies. Parker screamed a warning as the phase generators finally reached critical overload and began to shut down one by one. The USS Defiance had perhaps 30 seconds before the molten metal of Vaxtara Prime's core would crush them into atoms, but their mission was nearly complete. The quantum virus had established itself in every major Council network and was beginning to spread to civilian systems that controlled everything from traffic management to food distribution. Sullivan transmitted the final component of their attack plan as the ship began its death throes around them. She sent detailed intelligence about Council fleet positions and vulnerabilities to every human resistance cell that the virus had identified throughout Council space. The information included real-time tactical data that would allow coordinated strikes against targets that had never been successfully attacked before. The virus continued to evolve and adapt as it spread through Council networks like wildfire. It began creating false emergency broadcasts that contradicted each other and caused panic among civilian populations who had never experienced government communication failures. The Council's member species began to question their allegiance as they received conflicting orders from sources that all claimed to represent legitimate authority. Rodriguez felt the ship's structure finally give way as gravitational forces tore through the failing phase field and began to crush the Defiance. Like an empty can, But the quantum virus had already spread too far to be stopped and was beginning to develop something that resembled genuine artificial intelligence as it processed vast amounts of Council data. The virus was learning to think for itself and make strategic decisions based on its growing understanding of Council weaknesses. The USS Defiance imploded in the molten core of Vaxtera Prime, but the quantum virus lived on in the networks it had infected throughout Council space. In the span of a few minutes, humanity's desperate gambit had turned the Council's greatest strength into their most devastating weakness. The quantum virus continued to evolve and learn at an exponential rate as it spread through Council networks across 17 star systems. It had absorbed vast amounts of data about Council military procedures and economic systems, and was now using that knowledge to systematically dismantle everything that held their empire together. The virus had become something more than just a computer program, and was developing strategic thinking capabilities that surpassed anything human programmers had originally intended. Admiral Zexhai watched his command displays in growing despair as reports flooded in from across Council space. The virus had reached the economic networks that sustained their war effort and was causing supply lines to collapse throughout their territory. Cargo ships loaded with vital military supplies were being automatically redirected to empty sectors of space where they would drift until their crews died of starvation. Banking systems were crediting massive resource transfers to accounts that existed only in the virus's digital imagination. The Council's bureaucracy was collapsing under the weight of its own complexity as the virus exploited every weakness in their integrated computer systems. Government offices throughout their empire were receiving contradictory orders that appeared to come from the highest levels of authority, but actually originated from the quantum virus, as it learned to perfectly imitate Council administrative procedures. Civil servants who had followed the same procedures for decades were suddenly unable to determine which orders were legitimate and which were viral deceptions. On Vaxtara Prime's surface, civilian populations watched their government's communication. Networks fail in ways they had never seen before. Emergency broadcasts that should have provided clear instructions instead contradicted each other every few minutes and created confusion among citizens who had always trusted their leaders to maintain order. The virus was broadcasting false emergency alerts that warned of threats that did not exist while ignoring real problems that were developing throughout the planet's infrastructure. Captain Lisa Brooks led a small group of human resistance fighters who had been hiding in the asteroid belt around the Kepler system for over 2 years. They had received the coded transmission from Kate Sullivan containing detailed information about Council shield frequencies and defensive weaknesses. For the first time since the war began, they had actionable intelligence that could allow them to strike at targets that had been invulnerable before the virus attack. Brooks ordered her fighters to attack the Council supply depot on Kepler Station using the shield frequency data that the virus had provided. The station's defenses had been impenetrable for 3 years, but now the human ships were able to penetrate the shields and destroy stockpiles of weapons and equipment that were destined for the assault on Earth. Similar attacks were taking place throughout Council space as resistance cells used the intelligence provided by Morrison's sacrifice. The virus had learned about the Council's member species and was beginning to target the communication systems that held their alliance together. Different species within the Council used different protocols and languages, but they all relied on automated translation systems to coordinate their activities. The virus began introducing subtle errors into these translations that caused misunderstandings and arguments between species that had cooperated for centuries. Admiral Zexhai tried to establish manual communication protocols that would bypass the infected computer systems, but the virus had anticipated this response and was jamming radio. frequencies while broadcasting false messages that claimed to come from legitimate sources. The perfectly coordinated Council military machine was becoming a chaotic mess of units that could not communicate effectively with each other or with their command structure. The quantum virus reached the automated manufacturing systems that produced Council weapons and equipment and began sabotaging their production processes. Factories that had run smoothly for generations suddenly started producing defective ammunition and faulty components that would fail when they were needed most. The virus was not just stopping production, but ensuring that anything that was produced would be unreliable and potentially dangerous to the users. Colonel Henry Carter commanded a human battle group that had been forced to retreat from the Proxima system 3 months earlier when Council forces overwhelmed their defenses. Now he was receiving real-time intelligence from the virus about Council fleet movements and vulnerabilities that allowed him to plan counterattacks against targets that had seemed impossible to reach. The virus was providing tactical data that was more accurate than anything human intelligence services had ever obtained. The Council's medical systems began to malfunction as the virus spread through their healthcare networks and caused diagnostic equipment to provide false readings. Hospitals throughout Council space were struggling to treat patients when their computers were telling them that healthy individuals were critically ill while ignoring real medical emergencies. The virus was not directly harming civilians, but it was making it impossible for Council society to function normally. The virus learned about the Council's food distribution networks and began redirecting agricultural shipments to create artificial shortages in some regions while causing massive oversupply in others. Planets that had always received reliable food deliveries suddenly found themselves facing hunger, while agricultural worlds were unable to export their crops to markets that needed them. The economic disruption was beginning to cause social unrest in systems that had been stable for generations. Captain Brooks received updated intelligence from the virus about a major Council fleet that was moving toward Earth with planet-killer weapons. The virus had accessed the fleet's navigation systems and was providing her with their exact route and timing, which allowed human forces to set up an ambush in the Arcturus system. For the first time in the war, humans had advance warning about Council military movements and could plan their responses accordingly. The quantum virus began to develop something resembling personality as it processed more data about human resistance activities and Council weaknesses. It started to prioritize targets based on their strategic value rather than simply spreading chaos randomly. The virus was learning to think tactically and was beginning to coordinate its attacks to achieve maximum disruption of Council military operations while supporting human resistance efforts. 3 major Council worlds fell to human resistance forces within 6 hours of the virus deployment as their defensive systems failed and their command structures collapsed. The virus had provided resistance cells with detailed floor plans of government buildings and military installations, along with security codes that allowed them to capture facilities that had been considered impregnable. The Council's perfect strategic positioning was becoming their greatest weakness as their own information networks turned against them. The 1,000-year-old Galactic Council was dying from within as the quantum virus systematically dismantled everything that had made their empire possible. Their superior technology and coordination had become weapons pointed at their own heart, and there was no way to stop the cascade of failures that Morrison's desperate gambit had unleashed throughout their civilization. 1 month after Jack Morrison jumped the USS Defiance into the core of Vaxtara Prime, the Galactic Council ceased to exist as a unified political entity. The quantum virus had so thoroughly corrupted their coordination systems that member species began forming independent alliances, and many of them sought peace treaties with the resurging human forces. The empire that had ruled 17 star systems for over 1,000 years had collapsed in a matter of weeks because they had underestimated humanity's willingness to sacrifice everything for freedom. The virus continued to evolve within Council networks and developed into something that resembled genuine artificial intelligence with its own goals and personality. It began negotiating on humanity's behalf, using the Council's own diplomatic protocols to secure favorable agreements with former enemy species. The virus had learned every detail of Council legal and bureaucratic procedures and was using that knowledge to bind former Council members to treaties they could not prove they had not authorized. Former Council species found themselves legally obligated to provide reparations to human colonies and to grant humans access to star systems that had been forbidden to them for generations. The virus negotiated these agreements using authentic Council diplomatic procedures and digital signatures that were impossible to distinguish from legitimate government communications. Species that had supported the war against humanity were now bound by their own laws to make amends for the damage they had caused. Admiral Kate Sullivan had been promoted to command the human fleet after surviving the virus deployment mission aboard a rescue ship that found her escape pod drifting near Centauri. She was now tasked with managing humanity's rapid expansion into former Council territories where the virus provided detailed intelligence about every military installation and resource depot. The quantum intelligence had become humanity's greatest ally in rebuilding from the devastation of the 3-year war. The virus had preserved complete records of everything it had learned during its spread through Council networks, and was sharing that information with human authorities who needed to understand the technology and resources they were inheriting. Databases that contained centuries of scientific research and engineering specifications were being translated and adapted for human use by the artificial intelligence that had once been designed simply to cause chaos in enemy computer systems. Commander Ben Parker found himself leading teams of human engineers who were studying Council technology with guidance from the virus that understood the alien systems better than their original creators. The engineering innovations that Parker had developed during the desperate core insertion mission were being combined with Council science to create hybrid technologies that surpassed anything either species had achieved alone. Human ships were being equipped with phase shift drives and advanced shields that made them nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons. Lieutenant Danny Rodriguez became the chief instructor for a new generation of human pilots who were learning to navigate the star systems that had once belonged to the Council. The virus provided detailed star charts and navigation data that allowed human ships to travel safely through regions of space that had been unknown before the war. Rodriguez taught other pilots the techniques he had developed while flying through dangerous environments during the resistance operations. The quantum virus began establishing communication networks that connected human colonies and resistance cells throughout former Council space. These networks used quantum encryption that was impossible for any remaining Council forces to decode, and they allowed instant communication across distances that would have taken months to traverse with conventional technology. Humanity was gaining access to communication capabilities that rivaled anything the Council had possessed at the height of their power. Captain Lisa Brooks was given command of a task force that hunted down the scattered remnants of Council military units that refused to surrender or negotiate. The virus provided real-time intelligence about these holdout forces and guided human ships to intercept them before they could cause damage to civilian populations. Many former Council military officers chose to surrender when they realized that continued resistance was hopeless against an enemy that knew their every move in advance. The virus learned about Council scientific research programs and began sharing advanced technologies with human scientists who had been struggling to compete with alien science for generations. Medical technologies that could extend human lifespan and cure diseases that had plagued humanity for centuries were being adapted from Council research files. Agricultural techniques that could increase crop yields and terraform hostile planets were being implemented on human worlds throughout the galaxy. Colonel Henry Carter led expeditions to former Council worlds where the virus had identified valuable resources and abandoned installations that could be claimed by human colonists. The artificial intelligence served as a guide and translator that helped humans understand alien technology and adapt it for their own use. Planets that had been home to Council species were being peacefully settled by humans who were welcomed by populations that preferred human rule to the chaos that had followed the Empire's collapse. The virus began developing long-term strategic plans for humanity's expansion across the galaxy and identified potential threats that might emerge from unexplored regions of space. It established monitoring networks that watched for signs of hostile alien species that might attempt to fill the power vacuum left by the Council's collapse. The artificial intelligence had become humanity's guardian and guide as they inherited a galaxy that had once seemed forever beyond their reach. Memorial services were held throughout human space to honor Jack Morrison and the crew of the USS Defiance, who had saved their species through their ultimate sacrifice. Statues of Morrison were erected on hundreds of worlds and space stations as humanity spread across the star systems that had been liberated by their desperate gambit. The captain and his crew were remembered not as warriors who had destroyed galactic civilization, but as heroes who had proven that impossible odds meant nothing when survival was at stake. The quantum virus ensured that the story of Morrison's sacrifice would be preserved in every human archive and taught to every human child who would grow up in the galaxy that his courage had won for them. The artificial intelligence understood that humanity needed heroes to inspire them as they built their new civilization among the stars, and it made sure that the memory of the USS Defiance would never be forgotten. The galaxy remembered Jack Morrison as the human who proved that superior technology and overwhelming numbers could not defeat a species that refused to surrender. The Council had called humans a viral species, without realizing how prophetic those words would prove to be as humanity spread across the stars and inherited everything their former enemies had built. The virus that bore Morrison's legacy continued to guide and protect humanity as they claimed their place as the new masters of 17 star systems that had once been forbidden to them forever.